Should have 33 to 36.
I have those pages.
Something
33, 34.
Okay. I'm not sure what's going on with this schedule lately.
I have 33 to 36.
Okay. And well, okay. Did you learn? It seems to be doing odd things. Look. Alright, so we continue. Starting on page 36. Or actually page 33 rather. We go through page 36. So so we're talking about the fact that the whole of Germany besought the pontiff to utter the final judgment between the two rivals, Sir Rudolph on the one hand and Henry IV on the other. A civil war having broken out, which again is always a danger, even when somebody is deposed or could be deposed in the manner of Henry IV. Still, the Pope, absolutely speaking, can do that, but that doesn't mean that everybody's going to actually follow that. It could be that the now illegitimate monarch is still retains the loyalty of some people for whatever reason, and so can still start a war. Because the power to wage a war is not the same thing as to legitimately rule a nation. Those are two different things. So in any case, once more, St. Gregory VII strove to move the stubborn mind of Henry, who rejected all terms of accommodation. The time for reasoning was past, and St. Gregory saw that he must now act. He called a council at Rome, the seventh held in his pontificate, so we would do a total of 9. These are local councils. Even when it's held by the Pope, it's still considered to be a local council, unless, of course, he gives it the authority of an ecumenical council. The Pope can do whatever he wants with any document containing doctrine or discipline. These are not listed amongst the general councils, local councils to deal with local problems. These are considered to be. So after the renewal of the anathemas against investitures, the envoys of Rudolph were introduced and stated their charges against Henry IV. The Pope arose and spoke at length upon his efforts to restore peace to the empire and the obstacles ever thrown in his way by Henry. Then, in a splendid outburst of eloquence addressing St. Peter and Paul, whose authority he represented, he pronounced sentences as follows: St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles, and thou, St. Paul, great teacher of nations, deign, I beseech you, to hear and favorably hear my words. It is my faith in you. And notice here that in a case like this, you'd expect to be hearing thee and thou when addressing saints, but keep in mind, we do have that actually, thou, St. Paul, but you in this case is addressing them both together, which is a reminder that you actually in English is the plural, and that in current day English we actually use the plural in place of the singular. So you might think it sounds a little bit modern to be saying you and addressing saints. Well, that's because it actually is plural here. So I beseech you to hear and favorably hear my words. It is my faith in you, after God and his Holy Mother, the Holy Virgin, that bears me up against the sinful and wicked, and enables me to encourage your faithful servants. The kings of the earth, the princes of the world, have met together against the Lord and against you. They have said, let us break their yoke and cast it far from us. Their chief, Henry, whom they call king, has risen up against your church and endeavored to cast me down from the pontifical throne. Remember, they called him the monk Hildebrand in a case of not only, of course, schism, but also just extreme personal disrespect to address the Pope in that way, refer to him personally in that way, when he is actually the Pope. It's customary to refer to anti-popes as just by their regular names, but to refer to an actual Pope by that is extreme disrespect. Extreme. So he refuses all proposals of peace and rejects the decision of the Diet, which was to end these long-continued wars. He has taken the lives of a multitude of Christians, given up the churches to the profanation and plunder of his troops, and carried desolation throughout the whole Teutonic kingdom. So German kingdom. Therefore do I, trusting in the mercy of God and of his mother, the Virgin Mary, and by your authority, excommunicate Henry and all his abettors. I declare him deposed from the government of Germany and Italy, and deprived of the royal power and dignity. I forbid every Christian to obey him as king, and release all who have sworn fealty to him. Which, remember, something possible at this time. Everything is based on these oaths of fealty. Let's always keep. Remember that was the system of the day, which is actually in itself a very good system. So let Rudolph, the choice of the Germans, rule and defend the kingdom which is henceforth his. To all his followers I grant absolution from their faults and the apostolical benediction. As Henry is justly stripped of the royal dignity in punishment of his pride, his disobedience, and faithlessness, the royal power and authority are therefore bestowed upon Rudolph as the reward of his humility, his submission, and uprightness. Henry IV thought himself strong enough to cope with the power which had chastised him. He met the sentence of deposition by the false councils of Mentz and Brixen, which declared St. Gregory VII unworthy to govern the church, as though he had any competence to decide upon that under any circumstances. In a council of 29 bishops and the seminarical prelates, we have resolved, to look at every word of this here, this is not a statement of worth anything in itself, but just notice how extremely disrespectful it is referring to Hildebrand again, the baptismal name of St. Gregory VII, calling him the abettor of the heretical Berengarius, which is just a complete joke. That's again, this is what they say, it's not to be taken seriously, so I won't address every word of it. But it just, a group of low characters here. Clearly low characters because they have engaged in seminarical prelates, have attempted to buy sacred things. It's not something any upright character would try to do. Given that we have the condemnation of St. Peter himself of the attempt to do so in the very Acts of the Apostles. So it doesn't exactly take a great deal of investigation to see how malicious that is. And therefore, just whoever does it, attempts that knowingly and willingly, is of low character indeed. So amidst these gross insults, inspired by the most bitter hatred, it is somewhat astonishing to meet the charge of favoring the heresy of Berengarius, which St. Gregory had solemnly condemned in a council held in 1078. So Berengarius held some heresies concerning the real presence. What exactly those errors were is not our main focus right now, but just remember that he held some errors concerning the true presence, some serious, in fact, invented some heresies about it. Since St. Gregory VII condemned it. So, it was absolutely, why they decided to bring up that, to invent this particular charge is not entirely clear, but they just wanted something, so they went for that, for whatever reason. But notice that the heresiarch had even made his final abjuration into the hands of the pontiff. So he himself actually abjured his own error, and did so before St. Gregory VII. So maybe that's why I'm calling him an aider and abettor of a heretic, because he received his abjuration, but that's not aiding somebody in heresy yet. These people are not to be taken seriously, clearly. So, moving on. After this violent proclamation, the bishops of Brixen unanimously elected as anti-pope Guibert of Ravenna, who took the name of Clement III. So, again, typically refer to Anti-popes just by their regular names, so we'll continue to refer to him as Guibert of Ravenna. He forthwith appeared in pontifical attire and solemnly swore to protect Henry IV. The pretender to the apostolic title set out for Italy, attended by a pompous escort. Henry lent all his influence to an election commanded by himself, which was nevertheless received with indignation by every true Christian. So, as a general rule, there may have been some who were low enough to go along with that, but generally speaking, everybody just rejected that for the farce that it was, and with righteous anger. So Rudolph, meanwhile, prepared for a struggle, which must now be decisive. So the two armies met in the month of October in 1080 near Merseburg in the marshes of Brunna in Germany. Long story short, the Rudolph's side won, but this was a classic example of a Pyrrhic victory because he was mortally wounded at the end of it by one Godfrey de Bouillon, who will become much more famous later on for much better reasons, as our author hints to here, that he would atone for the errors of his earlier years by deeds of deathless fame on the hallowed soil of Palestine. So, in other words, he would spearhead the First Crusade at the end of this, about not quite 20 years after this. Jerusalem was very famously retaken in 1099 AD, so an easy date to remember, 1099, right at the end of the 11th century. But this is the year 1080 we're looking at, and he's on the wrong side of things at the moment. But yeah, he would make up for that. Sometimes people manage to get their acts together and do much better later in life than they did earlier. That's not unheard of. So Henry IV, now master of the Italian passes, poured down his triumphant troops upon these rich and smiling valleys. So with the death of Rudolph, Henry IV gains the upper hand again, unfortunately. His party grew with fearful rapidity. Simoniacal or concubinary clerics and bishops flocked to the protection of the anti-pope, known often as Clement III, and formed the schism known in history as the Schism of the Henricians, for obvious reason, caused by Henry IV. And so clearly, Henry IV is just absolutely horrible and surrounds himself with the lowest characters, simoniacal and concubinary clerics and bishops, those who have no scruple about living in sin, living in open concubinage even, and buying and selling sacred things. Those who are okay with that are the people who are around him. Birds of a feather flock together, as they say. Shows you the character of Henry IV, which was obvious enough anyway. But it's just this is just a bunch of thugs who are doing this. They held their own peculiar doctrine, and no surprise there, and taught that the emperor should exercise the chief authority in the choice of popes and bishops. That sure is a case of groveling if there ever was one. Again, this is how heretics and other scoundrels manage to survive, is getting the protection of the civil power, at least those who claim it. In this case, only a claimant. Henry IV was clearly deposed. But this is how people like that survive. They have to suck up, as they say, to those who protect them. They have to butter them up and then grovel before them. Yeah, again, we find in the history of the Church and Martin Luther, for example. So, Henry IV. Oh, sorry, I skipped something. That they thought also that no pope or bishop could be deemed lawfully elected unless chosen by the emperor or the king of Germany. So not only groveling before, trying to invent new principles to grovel before all civil power in general, but very specifically before Henry IV. Finally, that no account was to be made of a sentence of excommunication pronounced against a temporal sovereign. How convenient as well. So, that's all just a case of groveling. That's all there is to that. None of that to be taken seriously. There's absolutely no basis in divine revelation for any of that. They just made up all of that because they're lackeys of Henry IV. And that's the long and short of it. So Henry IV, as may easily be imagined, favored a doctrine so much in keeping with his own views. Of course, St. Gregory saw himself forsaken by nearly the whole of Italy. One, however, remained true to him in the hour of trial. The heroic Countess Matilda, with unshaken courage, strove to stem the advancing torrent of German invasion. So the pen of history, as this particular author, refuses to record all the woes that followed in the train of this schism. So in other words, it was bad. So bad that we can't even write it all down. They were indeed fearful, since they nearly annulled the salutary reform begun by the genius of Gregory VII, with the salvation of modern civilization. So, yeah, look at the Middle Ages, modern being modern at that time, current day at that time. The fearless pontiff awaited the coming storm with that calm, undaunted bearing which marks the man of high and holy aims. He knew that man's mightiest workings for the triumph of error must come to nothing, to naught, not meaning nothing, at the bounds which the Almighty's hand has set to crime and injustice. So we wish, he wrote to all the faithful, that your contempt for the pride and endeavors of the wicked may equal ours, and that you should rest more assured of their fall in proportion as they pretend to rise higher. So it is very common throughout history that those who give trouble to the Holy See meet a bad end. So he seems to be alluding to that. The confidence of St. Gregory was soon awarded by the frank and sincere submission of Robert Guiscard, who came to swear fealty to the pontiff, received absolution from the censures he had previously incurred, and promised to hold his sword at the service of the Holy See. Meanwhile, the Saxons, dispirited for a moment by the death of Rudolf, found new courage, and meeting at Bamberg, they elected Hermann of Luxembourg king of Germany. So Luxembourg to this day, or actually it's not quite the right spelling, but Luxembourg, this is probably just an older spelling of it, but to this day is an independent duchy, Luxembourg. That's probably just essentially a typo on this page right here. So sprung from an old and illustrious race, he would have been a man of unusual, should be brilliance, but in a season of such political confusion, it would have required even more than the hand of a hero to seize and hold the scepter. So Henry IV was dominating at this point, unfortunately, as even evil oftentimes on this earth is allowed to prosper, and sometimes it seems strange. Well, why is that? And the reason is, well, that the wicked, everybody's done something good. Even the worst people to ever live did something good in their lives, and God in his justice will actually see to it, even so, however bad they are, that whatever good they do is rewarded. But because they're going to go to hell for eternity, they can't be rewarded after this life, so they get the reward on earth. And that's why many times you see, put it this way, that to see somebody living a life of sin apparently without any scruple of conscience, and in the midst of all kinds of temporal prosperity, that's a very bad sign for that soul. Obviously, to have no qualms of conscience in the midst of a life of sin is something terrible to consider, but it's a particularly bad sign if they have that in the midst of all kinds of prosperity, with seemingly everything going their way, fame and riches, etc., whatever they want, pretty much they get, it seems, in some cases. And, we leave ultimately everything to the judgment of God, but that may well be because they're going to go to hell for eternity, and they're just receiving whatever reward that they deserve, which is a purely natural reward for natural good done on this earth. So that's the reason, that's the short explanation as to why many times the wicked prosper on earth, while the good suffer. Which is, it might seem, it may be completely counterintuitive to a human way of thinking, but that is that the wicked should prosper on earth, and that the good should suffer is the justice of God being administered to the wicked on this earth, and the mercy of God being exercised towards the good, because it allows them to work away the temporal punishment due to sin on earth, where they can actually merit by doing it, and where it's much less suffering is required to do away with much less temporal punishment than would be required in purgatory, where of course there is no merit. So sometimes it might seem frustrating. Why is it that evil is allowed to prosper so much? Well, that's the short answer. So in any case, this Hermann was crowned at Goslar and repaid the choice of his countrymen by the services of his prodigious energy and courage. But his army was infected with a spirit of desertion, and he was soon forced to seek shelter in Lorraine, where he died without having secured the possession of a crown which he would have fairly won by his virtues and his valor. Because notice this author refers to Lorraine, most of the times referred to as Alsace-Lorraine, because the German name for it is Alsace. And clearly, if he's taking refuge there as a German, then it's under German rule at this time. But the French always wanted that, and they call it Lorraine. So, in any case, that's for another. There's a lot more to be said about that, but that's another story completely from what we're looking at right now. So, at the moment, don't worry about that too much. The spring of the year 1082 found Henry encamped with a considerable army under the walls of Rome. He was accompanied by Guibert of Ravenna, remember, who's claiming the title of Pope Clement III at this point, who wore a sword as unscrupulously as if he had not clothed himself with the purple. The purple meaning the regal garb of the Pope. So he's, obviously it's not intrinsically evil for a Pope to carry a sword, but it's most definitely unfitting that he should do so in any kind of open, habitual manner. It's just completely unfitting. And so he's claiming to be Pope, but also still carrying a weapon around, for whatever reason. But the reason is evident enough. He's part of Henry IV's military campaign here against the real Pope, St. Gregory VII. So for 3 successive years did the German troops besiege the city. So that's the thing about sieges, is that they could go on for a very long time. And it can last for years, as you have right here. Which doesn't say a whole lot for their efficiency. Rome is not a particularly defensible city. It's actually a bit of a mystery as to why it is where it is. Right? Who thought that was a good place to found a city? It's in a very low-lying, swampy area, so it's very flat, easy to get into. I mean, you see the reason why the Emperor Constantine wanted to shift the capital away from there to Constantinople, which is famously very defensible. And there are all kinds of advantages to having your imperial capital at a place like Constantinople. Even though that was just a little town at the time, he really built it up into an imperial capital, essentially leaving Rome as a backwater place. Which, in physically, it is, always has been, a swampy area, but it became politically as well a backwater place after that. So the empire was really no longer Roman at that point. But in any case, these troops besieging Rome for 3 years, again, doesn't say a whole lot for their efficiency. So St. Gregory, in any case, withdrew to the castle of St. Angelo. So the castle, the very famous Castel Sant'Angelo, which stands in Rome to this day. You can see it. Very near St. Peter's. Yeah, and that is a stronghold for sure. Sir Robert Guiscard was too deeply engaged with the Byzantine Greeks to give the pontiff any instant help, so immediate help. That's a somewhat older way of saying that. All Henry's proffered bribes failed to win the loyalty of the Romans from their pontiff. The Romans at this point, keep in mind, we're talking about just the Italian inhabitants of Rome. The ancient Romans have ceased to exist at this point. Just eventually went out of existence. All the qualities of ancient Rome disappeared. Were eventually just faded away over time. So Romans at this point, you can still refer to Romans even to this day, but that means people just living in Rome. Hostilities were occasionally suspended by a momentary truce to admit of negotiations. In 1083, Henry agreed to the Pope's proposition that a council should be held at Rome for a final decision of the affairs of the Church and the Empire. The king pledged himself to give free passage to all who should come to the council, but with his natural dishonesty and in contempt of all international law, he arrested the deputies sent by Hermann and the German princes, as well as all the bishops of the opposite party who were on their way to answer the pontiff's call. So his lowness and treachery knows no bounds, clearly. In spite of all these obstacles, the council was opened at the appointed time. On the 3rd day, St. Gregory VII arose in the midst of the assembly as if endued with a supernatural power, and in a strain of earnest and overpowering eloquence, which drew tears from all his hearers, He spoke of faith, of Christian morality, of the courage and constancy demanded by the existing persecution. He seemed to feel that his voice now rose for the last time in favor of so just and holy a cause. Henry refused to give any measures of accommodation. Still, St. Gregory did not pronounce judgment upon him by name, but excommunicated in general all who had hindered the bishops and the German envoys from coming to the council or had held them prisoners. So he's already condemned Henry by name sufficiently. Previously, we saw that. So now doing it again, but in a different way under another title. This measure was the more spirited that the Pope was left almost alone to support the wavering courage of the Romans. But wearied out at length by the rigors of a protracted siege and by a constancy so much at variance with their restless and fickle disposition, the citizens sent a deputation to offer to Henry the keys of the city. So that is, of course, problematic. The king made his entry, accompanied by the antipope Guibert, on the 21st of March, 1084 AD. The heroic pontiff, witness of the defection of his subjects, withdrew into the impregnable citadel of Sant'Angelo. So citadel being it's the last stronghold in a city, usually some particularly heavily defensible, heavily fortified place that is the last point of, or the point at which you would make a last stand when all the rest of the city has fallen. That's the one final place of refuge. It might be even, say, a miniature castle within the city itself, a citadel, which the castle Sant'Angelo very much is. It's it's like its own. In fact, it is referred to as a castle all on its own. So a heavily defensible, a very easily well defensible place, heavily fortified. So Guibert was installed, or Guibert, depending, was installed in the Lateran Palace and crowned by the bishops of Modena and Arezzo before an immense concourse of the clergy and people. On Easter Sunday, March 31st, Henry and his Queen Bertha made their solemn entry into the Basilica of St. Peter, after which they repaired. They went to the Vatican, where Guibert placed the imperial diadem upon the brow of the king and proclaimed him patrician of the Romans. So that travesty was perpetrated on Easter Sunday. Robert Guiscard was, in the meantime, hurrying on with an army of 30,000 men to the Pope's relief. Henry, feeling himself unequal to the contest, hastily quitted Rome with his anti-pope, first for Civitavecchia, thence to Siena. So he beat a hasty retreat when it actually became clear that there was a force in the way that could actually give him a fight. Then he scampered. So, showing, even a prudent military commander, capable one, might get out of the way of a far superior force, but it's just emblematic of Henry's character to run away once the relief force is coming, just to scamper, as they say. But Robert the Rescuer was, okay, so we will continue on that next time. Things are pretty rough at this point, clearly. Domine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, mensum tuum presidium confugimus sancta Dei Genitrix, nostra supplicationes et dispicias in necessitatibus et periculis cunctis, libera nos semper, glorios et benedicta. Domine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.